So my name's Ian Walker. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's Esmée Fairbairn annual public lecture. Fairbairn was a city economist whose bequest that we owe this lecture to was driven by his desire that students should be exposed to an explanation of current events and topics of importance through the lens of economics. So Fairbairn felt that economic and financial education was a really important part of the things that we should do. And this lecture commemorates that. We have a long history of distinguished lecturers. I won't bore you with them. I just recall last year's lecturer, Ken Binmore, the man from Fun and Games, whose lecture was interesting in a number of ways, but drew my attention to the importance of John Rawls, a US philosopher, to the importance of inequality and the way in which he's inspired the way in which economists think about inequality. Today's speaker is Martin Ravallion. Martin's a professor at Georgetown University. He's had a glittering career, career. He has more than 200 publications, many of them in the world's most prestigious places, many of them in high-impact places. His research portfolio is highly concentrated on the topic of poverty and inequality. Measured by citations, he's actually the 20th most highly cited economist in the world. Measured by impact, I think he's substantially more important than that. Indeed, he spent the majority of the last 25 years of his life working for the World Bank. He left very recently, having spent the last 5 years as the research director at the World Bank. Martin is credited with the dollar-a-day metric that has been used extensively to measure progress in the reduction of inequality. And of course, that's been a kind of priority for the World Bank's Millennium Development Goals since 1980. Indeed, since that time, the number of individuals living in such extreme poverty has actually fallen dramatically. Of course, now the bank's goals are being redefined as we speak, and Martin's work, I'm sure, has influence over the way in which the new goals will be drawn up, despite the fact that he's no longer there. So today, I introduce Martin Ravallion, who will talk about anti-poverty policy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for Ian for inviting me here in the economics department of Lancaster University. And it's a great honor, and thank you for coming. This lecture actually began as my first lecture to my second and third year econ PhD students at Georgetown, and a course on basically applied econometrics in a development context. And I thought, like most econ PhD students throughout the world these days, my Georgetown students wouldn't know a lot about the history of thought. And I didn't know much about it either. How did we come to think the way we do about things like poverty in the world? So I did a lot of reading for this first lecture. I prepared more for this first lecture at Georgetown than I think I ever have for any lecture. And the reading continues. It's like a puzzle, I discovered. Trying to figure out all the bits and pieces of this puzzle, put them together in the shape of a reasonably convincing story about how we came to think about poverty and policies for fighting poverty the way we do. This fellow is Kautilya, 300 BC in India. Kautilya was arguably one of the first economists, if not the first, certainly one of the first policy wonks. Here is a serious policy wonk advising people in India, government at the highest levels, about economic policy. We're going to come back to Cotillier. We've got a cast of characters in this story, and cast is, as I say, still unfolding. In the question time, I'm happy for you to suggest others. Here we have the English working class in the around the turn of the 19th century, and according to the defenders of capitalism in this period, the English working class are here depicted in their favourite place, the English pub. But we're also going to have Adam Smith in this story, and Adam Smith plays a very important role. Adam Smith, despite a lot of the legacy he left in popular discussions, was really an incredibly progressive guy, and I'm going to talk a bit about him. We can't leave out Figaro. This is Figaro from Pierre Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro. He's going to play a role in this too, in this story. Michael Harrington, describing the faces and the lives of what he called the other America around 1970, was extremely important in America in the rediscovery of poverty. And last but not least, and we're going to have Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. He's going to play a role too. Three premises are now widely accepted. Poverty is a social bad. Poverty can be eliminated. And public policies can help achieve that outcome. I don't think there's much doubt that those premises are widely held, very widely held today, but they were not widely held 200 years ago, and that was my first discovery in preparing this lecture. There's been dramatic change in economic thinking about policy, about poverty and policy, but 5 quotes that really capture the change in views over this 200 years. This is from Philippe Pequet. The poor are like the shadows in a painting. They provide the necessary contrast. Philippe Pequet was a prominent physician, surgeon in France in the mid-18th century, also very prominent for his charitable works and his philanthropy. And he was certainly, he was not a nasty character in any way, but if you think about that representation, the shadows in a painting, it says something. Arthur Young, 1771, an agriculturalist, statistician, you could say an economist of sorts. Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they'll never be industrious. This is an idea that poverty, in fact, is fundamental for development. It's a social good. Alfred Marshall, and here we have 100 years later, 120 years later, huge change in views, but still questioning this and still recognizing that there's a premise, a widely held premise, that poverty is necessary. And Alfred Marshall asking, may we not outgrow the belief that poverty is necessary? Turning to the late 20th century, the motto of the World Bank, our dream is a world free of poverty. A motto I certainly have subscribed to. And most recently, Jim Yong Kim, in a talk at Georgetown that he gave 6 months ago, is there anyone today who would not commit to eliminating poverty? I'm going to go through and try to explain to you that change in perspective and why it happened. It's going to be a narrative about the history of thought. There's going to be lots of economics trying to understand that history. I'll avoid technicalities, but economics can actually help us understand economic thinking. There's also going to be a smattering of political economy. We're going to try and understand a little bit, the sort of political economy or the politics of all of this. I'm going to start with a very simple model. We're going to think about the dynamics of wealth at the individual level in a special way, and 2 important features. One, the existence of imperfect credit markets. Now, it's very hard to understand a lot of our discussion about poverty today if we don't have that feature. Credit markets don't work very well. An important way they don't work very well is it's very hard to borrow money to finance your children's schooling. And it's always been very hard. That means that poor people kids in poor families tend to have less schooling, fewer opportunities coming out of the fact that they just can't borrow. Their parents, it's very hard to borrow. Even with the active the student loan markets in the United States. It's still difficult, and we still see an economic gradient in schooling. Poorer people, poorer families getting less schooling, less high-quality schooling. We're also going to imagine each person faces has a desired capital stock. They would ideally like to reach some level of capital. Capital here can be human capital, non-human capital, financial capital, environmental capital. We think of a broad category of things. Everybody has this desired level of capital. If their own initial wealth is not enough to get over the kind of credit constraint that they need a minimum amount of capital to borrow in the capital market and the credit markets, they're going to be constrained. The marginal product of their capital will exceed the interest rate. They'd like to get more capital. They would drive the marginal product down, but they can't do it. Second feature is the existence of a threshold. We're going to allow the possibility there's some minimum level of wealth in order to be productive at all. Not just a credit constraint, but also a threshold, some minimum level of wealth, below which you can't produce anything. And that's very easy to motivate. The easiest way is to note the existence of a resting metabolic rate, or basal metabolic rate. The human body requires a minimum amount of nutrition to do anything at all. Just sitting here in this room listening to me, you're not burning many calories. But still, you would need, probably I'd guess, an average of 1,300 calories per person to do absolutely nothing. Now, if your livelihood depends on your ability to work, then you're going to have to get your caloric intake above that amount. So that minimum level of wealth, if on this diagram here we've got wealth at date t plus 1, wealth at date t, that's the minimum. That's the threshold. And if we're thinking of wealth here as the stock of your nutritional status, the accumulated nutritional intakes over some time, then you're going to have to get above this to be able to produce anything. And so we've got two features here, the credit market constraint, which sort of means that there's this curved bit depending on the curvature coming from the diminishing marginal product of capital, and we've got a threshold effect. You need a minimum level of wealth to make ends meet. Out of this, we have an interesting possibility of what are called multiple equilibria. There are three possible equilibria for this person. This lower equilibrium is destitution. If you fall into that equilibrium, you are in a poverty trap. I'm not going to assume there are poverty traps. Actually, I think there must be poverty traps. It's such a strong, motivated proposition. There are all kinds of other ways, by the way, we could get that threshold effect. This could also be just schooling. There are many students here. You try getting a job with 1 minute of schooling. Won't work. You'll need a minimum amount of schooling. Probably in England it could be 10 years before you're going to realize a return to that schooling. That's another example of this threshold effect. We can get threshold effects in technology and so on. Many examples. If you get caught in that equilibrium, bad, very bad. Up here we've got a nice stable equilibrium. You want to be up there. This is a diagram for each person. For each possible person, there's a low-level equilibrium, a trap, and a high-level stable equilibrium. And there's this point here, which is an unstable equilibrium. The existence of this means many things, and we're going to explain some of them along the way in this talk. One of them is that large shocks can create destitution. Small shocks may not matter. If you're in this point up here, a sufficiently large shock will throw you into destitution. You'll end up at point A. Alternatively, if you're at point A, you're going to need a minimum level of capital, increment to your capital, to get out of that. A small increment to your capital, let's say an extra minute of schooling, will do nothing to get you out of this poverty trap. You'll fall back to point A. There are the key bits of this model. An implication will be if you shock this economy enough, lots of little small shocks, two classes of people will appear. The people clustered around point A and the people clustered around point C. It doesn't mean it's a sharp division. It can be overlapping distributions. And we could have many poor people for which the point C, that point C up there, is a very low level of wealth. We're not saying there's no poverty at point C. Maybe lots of poverty for people at point C. They're just not in a poverty trap. Getting them out of poverty will be a matter of investing in them. There'll be higher returns. Any investment will yield some positive benefit, and they'll eventually escape poverty. Whereas the people at point A, they're going to need this minimum. There's a positive minimum. There's a certain push that will be necessary to get them out of poverty. We're going to think of two classes of policies. And this is really why this little bit of economics that I've given you is going to be so important, because the history of thought is really the history of these two types of policies. Protection policies are all the things that governments may do to help people deal with risk. It may do nothing for their steady state level of wealth. It just means, for example, if we've got the people caught in this point A here, they've got zero wealth, or effectively zero wealth, but they've still got a consumption level. Obviously they're alive. They've got incomes from their labour. They're consuming everything they produce in any period, and their incomes are fluctuating. So there are policies that can help them deal with that. Remember, the risk market's not working, the credit market's not working for them. It works well for people at a higher level. So we need those policies that will help protect them. And those are naturally we call protection policies. Promotion policies, a different sort of policies, are things that would, for example, help people get from point A to point C. Two types of policies then, protection and promotion. This is not my distinction. It actually comes from Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, although I'm giving it some formalization. Promotion policies are things that allow people to permanently escape poverty, including breaking out of poverty traps when relevant. Or, if they're at the point C, they're at a stable equilibrium and it's not destitution, to at least get them out of poverty. Anti-poverty policy I'm going to define as both of these things. And the development of anti-poverty policy, the idea of anti-poverty policy, is essentially combining the two things. We're going to study the history of how that combination happened. We're not going to talk much about rights-based approaches to distributive justice. I will talk about Rawls, who I think was extremely important, but I'm not going to give the rights-based approaches to distributive justice that are prominent in political philosophy much role in the story. I'm going to focus much more on policies and poverty. And really it's the economics of the thing that drives that emphasis. The focus will be on whether policies help people escape poverty and help protect them. And the bottom line, and one message for this whole talk, and this last thing here, the last 200 years, this last point, the last 200 years have seen this dramatic shift from what I call the protection-only approach to anti-poverty policy to protection plus promotion. Okay, establishing all of that, we've got to go back to the 18th. We're going to start this script is going to start rolling in pretty much the 18th century with mercantilism. Mercantilism was the first economics, essentially, and economics meaning a rigorous definition of ends and means. And the ends for mercantilists were the export surplus of the economy, basically the balance of trade. That's how you measured the success of the economy. That was the only thing that really mattered. That meant that everything was a zero-sum game globally. The balance of trade is zero globally. So each country would be struggling to increase its exports relative to its imports, to increase its power in the world economy as it was seen. The power of the realm depended on its export surplus. This kind of economics led to all kinds of emphasis on things like finding cheap imports. The colonies were seen as useful for this purpose, cheap raw materials, and very importantly on cheap and poor labour. So the economics said, in simplest possible terms, we need people to be very poor because we want their wages to be low, so the export surplus is higher, so the realm will be more successful. So in some somewhat strange way, economics was telling us this story. This came to be called the utility of poverty. Poverty was seen as essential to economic development. Hunger would encourage work, and lack of hunger would do the opposite. What we have then is what in economics we call a negatively sloped labour supply schedule, that the income effect, for the economists in the audience, the income effect dominates the substitution effect. This was a fundamental premise of the way people thought about poverty at this time. In other words, what happened with higher wages? Workers went off to the pub. That's what it means to say the income effect dominates the substitution effect. Basically, the higher wages, their demand for all normal goods increases, including leisure, and their demand for beer increases as well. And there's no substitution effect. And you see the writings about poverty at the time. For example, one quote here, "It is observable that where the highest wages are given, they do the least work, and the rest of the money goes to the alehouse." What about schooling? Well, that would surely be one way out of poverty. No. Mercantilist thinking was really quite opposed to the idea of schooling. One of the most prominent mercantilist thinkers is Bernard de Mandeville, writing here in 1732, "The surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor," as we've just said, "and great numbers of them should be ignorant as well as poor." Now, these are not some eccentric types, fringy people at the time. These are quite central characters. I mean, Bernard de Mandeville was controversial for some of the things that he thought, but actually not so much this. The mercantilists were dead against educating poor people. As an aside, could in fact de Mandeville been right? It sounds sort of objectionable, and we do have a fundamental ethical irritation to his views. But if you go back to that poverty trap model, remember one of the things about if you've shocked this economy enough and you've now got a working class of zero wealth, destitute people, and for most purposes till the late 19th century being poor was essentially being working class, at least in Europe, and you've got a bunch of people at that higher equilibrium, all nicely sorted into these two classes with these overlapping distributions. Well, that's an implication, in fact. Bernard de Mandeville may have been right in the sense that a little bit of schooling is just not going to be helpful. It's going to be a waste of resources. That's Recco's continuing today. As I was reading these views of Bernard de Mandeville, and shock, horror, how could he think that? And well, maybe it makes a bit of sense. But I was also reading a beautiful book by Catherine Boo called Behind the Beautiful Forevers. And I recommend this. It's also on my reading list for my undergraduates at Georgetown. Catherine Boo is a journalist in I believe still in the New York Times, but spent a year in a Mumbai slum and just recorded, non-fiction, what lives of people there. At one point in this book, she talks about Sunil, a young scavenger. Nobody's quite sure of his age, maybe 15, or it would be a wild guess. And Sunil was fully aware of how to get out of poverty. He knew exactly how to do it. There were three ways of getting out of poverty. The first was entrepreneurship, start a business. The second was schooling. And the third was politics or corruption. They were one way, not two ways. That was how you got out of poverty. Schooling was one of them, so he thought, I'll try doing some night classes with a student who was doing after the classes in the evening. And after a number of days, Sunil decided this wasn't going to work, for after days and days of rote learning, he had learnt the Twinkle Star song. I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but it's this song. You probably know it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Anyway, Sunil wisely thought, this is not going to help me get out of poverty. I'm not going to be any less hungry knowing the Twinkle Star song. I would need to sit in this class for another 10 years, and how am I going to afford that? Again, he's just realizing the raw fact of a credit market failure. Protection has a long history. For a long, long time, and you still hear it today. One of the oldest themes is poor people themselves are the main cause of their own poverty. It's due to their bad behaviours, moral weaknesses, excessive fertility, laziness, bad choices such as spending too much time in the alehouse. All of these views were wildly current, and conveniently, all the elites would subscribe to these views at this time, almost all. Some of them bubbled up in the form of socialism in the mid-19th century, and we're going to come back to that. But they all agreed there was a public responsibility for protection. In fact, the mercantilists also saw that. In a kind of post-feudal economy, Who was going to look after and assure that a post-slavery economy, who was going to assure that the workers actually stayed alive? There had to be some protection. Promotion was a waste of money, but protection was important. If you're a slave owner, you internalize the protection because the worker is your property. But when you're a market economy with a free labour market, that's no longer the case. Public responsibility for protection actually goes back a long way, and here's the role of Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, in 300 BC. And Kautilya was this amazing guy, an academic advisor to royalty at the time, and lots of sage-like wisdom on everything you could imagine. If you're reading Kautilya, and I don't read Sanskrit, but there are translations of much of his writings. It's amazing. I found this translation. What did Kautilya recommend when a famine looms? The king should institute the building of forts or waterworks with the grant of food. So that's a workfare program, a relief work program. New Deal throughout the world, still going on. Or share his provisions with the people, transfers, cash or food. Very important. Or thirdly, entrust the country to another king. Give up. The Elizabethan poor laws, flashing forward quite a while, were an important innovation coming around 1600. The English poor laws were, I think, in many respects, the most well-developed, early developed form of a welfare state. Still fundamentally addressing protection, very little emphasis on promotion. Cash transfers implemented through the parishes and through redistribution within the parishes, so financed by local property taxation, were used to make state contingent transfers, meaning if you got unemployed, you got a transfer, you got sick, you got a transfer, and a very well-defined agenda. Quite universal, meaning that anybody became a widow, whether you're a poor or a rich widow, you were entitled to this relief under the poor laws. The central government essentially dictated the law, didn't finance it. It was up to each parish to finance it internally. So lots of horizontal inequality between parishes. A poor person in a rich parish was going to do much better out of this than a poor person in a poor parish. Okay, moving forward. That was the setting prior to what I'm going to call the first poverty enlightenment. There are going to be two of these poverty enlightenments. The first one around the latter 2 or 3 decades of the 18th century. What you have here is this graph is a graph of the incidence of the word poverty in all digitized books for each one of these years. This is produced from something called the Google Ngram Viewer. It's a very clever way of reading a lot of texts, millions, 10 million books, very quickly. And I can use this Google Ngram Viewer to read and look at the incidence of the word poverty. It's the incidence, it's not the actual number of times the word occurred, it's a percentage of all words at that date which are the word poverty. You can also use this, I've got a whole paper just on this Ngram Viewer, which I think is terrific for it opens up all kinds of interesting research issues. But I'm not going to go into those, but you can also use the Ngram Viewer to figure out, you can click on one of these points and find the things that use the word poverty and see whether what they meant by poverty is what you mean by poverty. And I've done that, and I'm pretty convinced the word poverty is pretty robust. You've got to allow for things like the word indigence. The word indigence was an old word for poverty, and I can show you this graph including indigence, but it looks the same. We had this explosion of interest in the last couple of decades of the 18th century. But I'm not identifying this first poverty enlightenment from the Google Ngram Viewer. I'm identifying it from the literature and the reading of history. For example, there's a series of books on the history of Europe that were produced in the 1930s, very authoritative volumes. I've got most of them, I think. I'm missing maybe one, but so most of these volumes are like a period history of Europe. The whole thing. He's like one volume might be 300 years. One entire volume is devoted to this 20-year period. There's so much happening in so many areas, and understandings of poverty and inequality is one of them. Changing popular attitudes, all over the place. And we're not quite sure why this bubbled up. There was certainly a rising poverty. We know that. We're pretty confident of that. Popular politics was flourishing and across all of Europe, and at least particularly France and Britain, but also evidence elsewhere. All kinds of things like the London Corresponding Society. This is a picture of one of the meetings of the London Corresponding Society. You can't see it too well. But they met. These caricatures are extraordinary, but they met and discussed things like suffrage. This was a radical idea at the time. Suffrage debate, how to get free elections that working class people had a vote in, went on for 100 years possibly in some places. I mean, a long period of protracted debate, and it took quite a while in England as well. Marriage of Figaro was a dramatic, Napoleon called this the revolution in words or something like that. It was a play, you might probably know, by Pierre Beaumarchais, and it had a Parisian audiences laughing at the aristocracy. This is scandalous to the aristocracy. Of course, Louis XVI banned the play. We all know what happened to Louis XVI. It really was an eye-opening thing. Figaro was a servant, and Figaro was told he was getting married. He was told his noble, his lord, had the right to sleep with the bride on the first night. Which is total outrage, but that was apparently possible. That still exists in parts of the world, by the way. But and he writes about the aristocracy in one bit, referring to his lord. What have you done to deserve such advantages? Put yourself to the trouble of being born? Nothing more. For the rest, a very ordinary man. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was prominent behind the scenes. If we go behind the literature and we see the philosophy of the times, and from very important in one crucial respect, the beginning of the opening of the question about how does inequality appear. A prevailing orthodoxy prior to this seems to have been that inequality and poverty were natural phenomena. They were things that nature somehow produced, and inequality was just to be accepted as such. And Rousseau just opened up that. He said, why? Essentially, in the philosophy, he was going back to contract theory, back to Hobbes, and Hobbes had a vision of essentially the contribution of society was asking the extreme counterfactual question: what happens if you took away society? The idea of the social contract theorists was imagine the world without social organization of any form. That was the natural state. Hobbes' idea was a really horrible, conflicting state. Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War, and probably not surprising, he had this view. Rousseau had much more a view that people are much more empathic. They were aware of the suffering of others, and the natural state would be one of greatest sympathy amongst people. From this, he essentially argued that poverty and inequality came out of the socialization process. They were not things that were fundamental in a natural state. All of this generated a lot of interest in poverty and inequality, and you've already seen the graph for poverty in the English language. Here's in the French language. We also saw the red line is inégalité. We saw some pretty sharp increases in attention to inequality in this period, very much ahead of from about 1750, ahead of poverty. Poverty peaked dramatically around 1790. It started to fade. Again, as in English, follows this trajectory we're going to come back to, this huge resurgence of interest in poverty in the late 20th century. That's going to be our second poverty enlightenment. English, in the English language, it doesn't look like at all. Inequality, I'm afraid, didn't get much attention. Poverty, yes. There's something here about the difference between the French and the English, I suspect, and I'm not going to go into that. Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in many ways, The Wealth of Nations, is a really, at its most fundamental level, is a damning critique of mercantilism. He is essentially arguing out for an alternative to mercantilism. And the most fundamental way, it was that the balance of trade should not be the way we judge an economy. We need to judge an economy by something much more aggregate. Today, I would recognize this as some kind of aggregate social welfare function, some sort of form, something not unlike the kinds of social welfare functions we think about in modern economic thought. We should think about, in Adam Smith's eyes, we should think about judging an economy by the aggregate command over commodities, including basic consumption needs. And this is a radical idea. He also talked about promotional anti-poverty policies, basic schooling of the common people. In many ways, Smith was far more progressive than his peers, and far more progressive than I think it took, not till really in economics, till the late 19th century, that we started to see such progressive views. Immanuel Kant also played a role, I think, in the philosophical underpinnings of this. And here the most important thing was just the realization of the moral worth of poor people. You had to have at some process in this thing, in some step in this thing, you had to have somebody at some point just basically saying that people are people. They have poor people of the same moral worth as non-poor people. You know, philosophically, it was a kind of radical idea. And in Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant is arguing this. And that, again, was a fundamental step. Also, unless people who've studied Kant know what I just said, and much more, I'm sure, I'm no specialist, but another was Kant's views on charity. This is extraordinary, because charity has been fundamental to people's thinking about poverty for ages, and religion played a very important role. Most religions, not all, but had applauded charity as virtuous. And Kant just asked a simple but probing question. Is that a respectful relationship between poor and rich people? If we only think of charity as the mechanism of poverty reduction or inequality, fighting inequality, is it a respectful relationship? Charity in Kant's eyes was something that gave welfare, gave power and privilege to the donor, and in many ways subjugated the receiver. This is the germ of the idea that maybe the state should be playing a role in that redistribution. And that was a much more respectful role for poor people than charity. All of this, if there are three words that summarize the first poverty enlightenment, it's liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty is pretty much understood the way today, the way it was understood then. So is equality. Liberty is essentially about the idea that you have every right imaginable as long as everybody else can have the same right. Equality was equality of opportunity. Equality of results was not on anybody's agenda till a bit later, and we'll come back to that. Fraternity was never terribly well defined, and I think it really took John Rawls 200 years later before the philosophical foundations of fraternity were well understood. As I said, equality, one of the striking things in this literature, before I started reading, I would have said equality of results was preceded equality of outcomes. Equality of outcomes preceded results, equality of opportunity in thinking. It's not actually true. Thinking started very much with the idea of equality of opportunity. And this, I think, was motivated very much by trying to remove those kind of glass ceilings on the middle class, getting to the positions of the elite. So the idea of equality of opportunity was very much motivated by equal access to jobs in government, to positions of power in a situation in which that access was highly unequal. Grotius Babeuf famously led a charge for equality of outcomes in the Second French Revolution, and he was beheaded for that in 1797. It was treated as treasonous. Actually, if you look at what Babeuf was asking for, it was really radical things like progressive income taxation. That was seriously radical. Okay, progressive market economy. This idea is also relatively new. Adam Smith, not so much, but the classical economists that followed Adam Smith were really quite negative on the idea that a market economy could ever help reduce poverty. When they looked at the amount of poverty they saw around them, they didn't have very good data. They had good reason to think of that. They saw from the Industrial Revolution, a bit after the start of the Industrial Revolution, they started to see technical progress, they started to see economic growth, but they couldn't see poverty reduction. And I think if you read the history, they're basically right. They're just one thing that they didn't factor in, the lags in the process. We're going to come back to that. But they concluded from that the only way to achieve poverty was moral restraint by poor people. They did not conclude, even John Stuart Mill, who was very supportive of education, was not particularly supportive, or not at all supportive, of public intervention, the state playing a role in providing that education. He understood moral restraint would help reduce poverty. That was the problem. Poor people were just reproducing too much. But he didn't carry it through because he was worried about the implications for liberty, carried through to a role for government policy. The Industrial Revolution and how long it took to impact on poverty, I think we can pretty much be confident now that the Industrial Revolution did reduce poverty. It just took a long time. The lags were quite considerable. There is a debate in this literature, particularly between Gregory Clark and Robert Allen, but we're really debating about whether it took 20 years or 50 years before we started to see rising real wage rates in the light of the Industrial Revolution. Here, the issue wasn't whether technical progress was labour augmenting. That was understood, and that was understood from an early time. It was rather what would happen on the supply side in the labour market. Again, the idea was there could be an increase in marginal productive capital, could increase demand for labour, but the supply response would soon remove that. The Marxists were arguing not so much on the bad behaviour of poor people, they were arguing instead on the reserve army of the unemployed. The amount of labour surplus in the economy is so large, it's extremely unlikely in their view that wages would ever increase. Really important question I don't think is well understood and answered in the question, why did it take so long? To this day, I still read people saying, oh, the Industrial Revolution had this, either saying it had no impact on poverty or saying it had a rapid impact on poverty. Both are wrong. It did have an impact on poverty. It just took a long time. Why, we're not so sure. I mean, you could make an Arthur Lewis type argument about labour surplus and the English economy at the time. That's sort of hard to believe. As a development economist, when I look at the structure of the English economy at that time, it's not, there are similarities with India today, for example, but I think it's a bit forced. There are other arguments, low savings of workers. If the models of this time and the thinking of this time is very much premised on the view that workers consumed everything they earned, it doesn't appear to be the case that savings were very, very large or quite small. An implication of that is that you couldn't finance the capital accumulation through savings mobilised from workers. You had to finance that capital accumulation from profits, and that was the only way. So until it was possible to finance capital accumulation some other way, you had this lag. Another, I think probably maybe even the most plausible explanation is falling food prices. Another aspect of technology that was changing dramatically was transportation and refrigeration. Particularly as the 19th century progressed, in the later part of the 19th century, we started to see a big decline in food prices in Europe, associated with, for example, access to the huge amounts of food that could be produced in the United States and Australia. Okay, another important thing that was happening here was the reforms to the Poor Laws. As I mentioned, the Poor Laws that started about 1600 were very, in many ways, successful at protection. The critiques were mounting. I think if it wasn't for the French Revolution, these critiques, the reforms, would have happened in England quite a few decades earlier, but all bubbled up around 1830. The Poor Laws were ready for a major reform. Why the French Revolution played a role is I think the English were very worried about the English elites were very worried about the French Revolution spilling across the English Channel. So there was a concern in their views that we couldn't rock the boat on anti-poverty policy. But once they were confident that spillover wasn't going to occur, we started to see reform efforts, and incentive effects played an important role. And this is one of the other things you learn from this history of thought, how the idea of incentives in anti-poverty policy, the importance of that argument, but also how much it's really been abused as an argument. The incentive arguments against the poor laws were so greatly exaggerated. As an economist reading this now, I just, no, it's just not believable. The incentive effects were as large as people claimed. And here I'm talking about the effects on labour supply, savings behaviour, and fertility. And even David Ricardo, otherwise very careful fellow, had most exaggerated views on this. Ricardo wrote that it is quite in the natural order of things that the fund for the maintenance of the poor should progressively increase until it absorbed all the net revenue of the country. This is like unbelievable. I mean, to get that kind of result, that the fund for the poor laws would rise so much out of these adverse incentive effects, with more and more people turning to the poor laws for relief and not working anymore, that was the essential argument. It's unbelievable. And I think that exaggeration of incentive effects to serve what are in the end political economy reasons, the reason the poor laws were under assault was that the landlords were in power in Parliament, and they were the ones financing, through this property tax, financing these poor laws in the parishes. The response, exactly the same. It's unfolding exactly as we see now in many developing countries, and we've seen in the last 20 years in many developing countries. You got out of you went from a uniform to a targeted policy. The influence of Malthus and Ricardo and others was very strong. All the calls were for better targeting, and the way to achieve that was through workhouses. Now, workhouses have been around, introduced in Amsterdam around 1600, I believe, but they were pumped up as a way of basically criminalising poverty. What you did is if people claimed to be poor, you insisted they could get relief, but only if they agreed to be confined to a workhouse, often separated from their families, and they could only get relief that way. Very quickly, the percentage of England's GDP that went on the poor laws went down, by my calculations, from about 2.5% in 1830 to 1% in 1840 out of this reform. What happened, of course, it was so stigmatising, it was so unpleasant, these workhouses, that a great many poor people just did not seek relief. Non-poor people, middle-income people, rich people, are not going to go to the poorhouses. That's not the issue. The issue is the coverage of poor people. But also what was also striking is the social reaction to this excessive use of targeting, excessive use of poorhouses, was quite widespread. I mean, Charles Dickens, the opening chapters of Oliver Twist, and here's Oliver again. But not just social commentaries and social novelists like Dickens, but Benjamin Disraeli, the head of the now Tory party, the Conservative Party, was also critical, very critical of these reforms. That message, that targeting fetishism, so it goes back all the way to at least to the early 19th century, that continues today, and I think we have to think very carefully about its role. Typically, we ignore a lot of the costs to participants from targeting. Incentives and redistribution, these arguments were going along as I've talked about, but there was some progress here. The emergence of promotional anti-poverty policies in the 19th century, where we're moving a bit forward to really the latter part of the 19th century. I don't call this a poverty enlightenment, but it certainly was an awakening, certainly a questioning in many quarters, and that quote from Alfred Marshall is an example. Also empirical research on poverty. Booth and Rowntree, Charles Booth and Schubert and Rowntree, documenting living conditions, and Frederick Engels as well, documenting living conditions of poor people. But when we got to Booth and Rowntree, unlike Engels and others previously, we really got to a quantification. And this was a major step, doing surveys to quantify rigorously the living conditions of poor people. And it was hugely influential. Charles Booth's documentation of poverty in London, so it's really careful. It's a fully archived now at the LSE. This is remarkable what he did. just really careful survey work. He didn't have some of the tools we have today. For example, he didn't have the idea of sampling. That was not well developed. That came 20, 30 years later. But he did a lot of very careful empirical work. And it had influence. People were shocked by the numbers to learn how poor people were. And that is another recurrent theme. And that's been, empirical research has been hugely progressive in influencing policy in this way. Another, Arthur Bowley. Now, Arthur Bowley is also important here because he really was arguably the most important figure in the invention of the sample survey. Arthur Bowley was the first professor of statistics at the LSE. But Bowley was also looking at poverty statistics as an important aspect of how we monitor social progress in the country. And that was a big step. Schooling. Well, the schooling debates are going on all through this period. Really 100 years of debate about particularly whether compulsory schooling, whether mass schooling under public support could ever be justified. The arguments were on all sides. A great deal of lobbying. Industrialists who were dependent on child labour were lobbying actively. Child labour was a fact of life. I mean, a working class kid typically, we don't know typically, but it would be quite common in the early part of the 19th century for a working class kid to be going to work at about the age of 7. That was really the norm. Working class, probably around 7. If they weren't in school at that age, there was often a lot of concern because they'd be around in the streets, they'd be causing trouble, and everybody would be much happier if they either went to school or went to work. But school was by and large not an option. The development of the mass schooling movement was one of the most progressive changes in Europe and North America. There very little on the national side till really the latter part of the 19th century. Some in Prussia and there were some important initiatives earlier. In Massachusetts, there was a very progressive initiative in the late 17th century. So some beginnings, and certainly some arguments, Condorcet in 1790. But it really what's really struck me is how long that debate took to unfold. Another side of the debate was, well, if you accept that it tends to be kids in poor families who are not in school, then we've got to understand that. We've also got to think about the incentives they face, the parents. Why aren't they in school? The opportunity cost of labour. All the time, think about incentives. While I think incentive arguments have been exaggerated to undermine efforts at redistribution, ignore incentives at your peril. Incentives are fundamental to everything in behaviour. It's just get the balance right. Incentive effects in understanding why kids were not in school are all about the costs of schooling. There were tuition subsidies, there were one possible policy response. And much later, conditional cash transfers essentially tried to compensate in various forms, Australia in the 1960s through to Brazil in the 1980s and 90s, tried to compensate poor people for the loss of income when the kid was in school. That was the big cost. Typically not the tuition cost. Sometimes that was important. It wasn't so much subsidizing the tuition cost, it was compensating for the loss of child labour, of the earnings from child labour. Okay, we've got a background now. We're going to move on to the second poverty enlightenment. Something really dramatic happened around 1950. This is a kind of discovery. For me, this was a discovery. I've been working on poverty for a lot of years. Something dramatic happened as illustrated by this picture. On the vertical axis, we have the percentage of people, as best I can say, percentage of people living below $1 a day over time on the horizontal axis. And I've spliced together the best estimates from two sources, a paper by François Bourguignon and Christian Morrison in the American Economic Review 2002, and a paper I wrote with Xiaohua Chen in the Quarterly Journal of Economics 2010. I just spliced the two together. And that's the picture I get. It's dramatic. Look what happened around 1950. If you project forward, here we have poverty rates in the world as a whole, as best we can determine. 80% of people living below $1 a day and higher, around 1820. Projecting forward, we would have had an extra 1.5 billion people living below $1 a day an extra on top of what we actually do have. In other words, there was a structural break in the trajectory and happened around 1950. I'm still not sure why. I'm going to try and fill in a little bit of some possible arguments. But 1950 saw a turning point. So dramatically, basically poverty, the incidence of extreme absolute poverty in the world is lowest now, and as I've shown you, at the time when attention to poverty is highest. The incidence of poverty has reached its lowest level at a time when the attention to poverty has reached its highest level. That's an observation for the political economy, which I'll turn to at the very end. Very importantly, the rediscovery of poverty in America. It's not like it suddenly increased, it just got rediscovered. Those decades of growth, rapid growth in the post-war period, post-Second World War period into the 60s, that was real, but that also underlined the rediscovery when people like Michael Harrington exposed this in a popular way. It was just like Charles Booth in London in 1890. It was an possibly People saw this, and it was a credible demonstration. Michael Harrington's book was marvelous, and possibly no less important, John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society. But Harrington's book is really, I think, the prize winner here. At the time, I went to see the print runs that were planned. At the time this book went to press, they printed 2,500 copies. Within 20 years, it had gone to 1.3 million copies. So clearly, the point of that is a bestseller, but equally, well, they did not anticipate it. This was a big surprise. There was also a political response. This book and Galbraith's book really, more than anything, prompted the Johnson administration's war on poverty. Not, by some accounts, a terribly successful war on poverty, but I think poverty, and it's clear now, poverty did fall in the United States in this period. There was an impact, it seems. It just did not reach expectations. A number of other things are happening behind the scenes of Michael Harrington's book, which is mass media, if you like. But behind the scenes, we had a realization, a return to the obvious point that we needed to make interpersonal comparisons of welfare. Strikingly, economists have been battling since about 1930, since Lionel Robbins, to try to rid economics of the need for interpersonal comparisons of welfare. That was doomed. You can't talk about poverty, you can hardly talk about much of redistributive policy without making interpersonal comparisons. Amartya Sen was also playing an important role in questioning some of the aspects of the welfare economics of the time, particularly in his writings on the Paretian liberal. Merlees on optimal commodity taxation. We had the first formulations, rigorous formulations, of the incentive argument. These are basically the same. Merlees was just making rigorous the kinds of arguments that Malthus and Ricardo had made in the form of a model of income taxation which embodied the equity efficiency trade-off, allowing for behavioural responses through labour supply. This was a huge step, and I always liked Merlees' paper, I think I thought it was a very important step. But again, looking back through time now, I think it was a major step. And thinking of the history, I think extraordinary. Formulations, a continue of this, different objective functions. Merlees had a utilitarian formulation when you think of poverty-based formulations. Again, a line of work that I think is very important. But if there's a single scholarly landmark of this period, my reading of the history, my first prize goes to John Rawls. The theory of justice, I read the theory of justice in the early 70s, and I reread it for this, quickly reread it for this this lecture. This is really, the importance of the theory of justice, I think, is the first rigorous formulation of a non-utilitarian theory of justice. Utilitarians have dominated this whole period. Now, utilitarianism has some attractive features, but has some unattractive features when you go to think about anti-poverty policy. Utilitarianism doesn't penalise inequality of utilities of welfare. It penalises inequality of income with diminishing marginal utility of income, but it doesn't say anything useful about inequality and poverty in the welfare space, which is ultimately how we have to judge it. It's not about incomes, it's about your welfare. Income is one of the things that matters to your welfare, of course, but only one of the things. It also opened up a questioning of the justice of institutions. And a questioning for which Rawls's answer said that fundamentally we should judge the justice of institutions by the importance of liberty and equality of opportunity, so reaffirming liberty and equality as in the French Revolution's motto, and the motto of France from the latter part of the 19th century, reaffirmed by Rawls. I don't think the contribution was there. If I see the contribution of Rawls now in this broader historical perspective, it must be in the idea of fraternity. It's this idea that the fraternity, and maximin, the idea that we should be maximising the welfare of the least advantaged, was something that Rawls derived from a fraternity perspective, that was the form for which a consensus about how we should behave in a veil of ignorance about our positions and individual positions, that would come emerge out of that veil of ignorance as really a fraternal solution to justice. Rawls's reinterpretation of fraternity is not without its problems, a number of problems, but I'm going to cut short on those because I'm running out of time. What did we see? I've talked about philosophical foundations. We had an explosion of interest, attention to poverty in this period. And I've just gone back to the Google Income Viewer here to show you a few things. Look at this. We've got discussions of poverty line booming up dramatically in this period, mentions of the incidence of the word poverty line, Gini, index of inequality, a host of things in policy, anti-poverty policy peaking, replaced more progressively by the words poverty alleviation. But you see the explosion of this period, and it's really striking. And it's continuing, it seems, and I've been now tracing this up to 2010, and it is continuing. New knowledge about poor people was also fundamental to it, vital registration systems, a host of things happening, again echoing that earlier experience with Charles Booth and the monitoring of and the documentation of poverty in London. The modern versions of that, things like the Living Standards Measurement Surveys, the National Sample Surveys of India, many efforts within rich countries as well. A host of initiatives there who are playing an important role. There was also a backlash, just as there had been in the early 19th century, a backlash to the first poverty enlightenment. There was clearly a backlash to the second. It was always essentially 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The backlash came in America in the form of Charles Murray's book, for example, an important example, Losing Ground. Again, the same arguments. Charles Murray, I don't think, was quite as much an exaggeration as Ricardo in thinking that the anti-poverty policy in the US would absorb the entire GDP. It didn't go quite that far, but it was equally exaggerated in many respects, and this was pointed out even at the time by Elwood and Larry Summers. Welfare reform started, the war on poverty turned into the war on welfare, continuing debates about the success of that effort. At the time, also, a rediscovery of poverty in the developing world, a host of changes going on. Now, this was not news to the developing world. Nobody was surprised to learn there was poverty. Everybody knew that. It was the rediscovery of poverty in the Western world and the impetus that gave to aid policy and so on. Lots of enthusiasm for fighting poverty in the developing world. The 1960s, the post-colonial period, we saw dramatic changes in interest and evolution in thinking about poverty in the developing world. We saw frustrated anti-poverty programs. If you read the documents of the time, both the Latin American literature and the Asian literature, Latin American literature a little bit earlier, more the 50s and the early 60s. The Indian literature, go read to the 1950s as well. Tremendous optimism about the ability of these post-colonial societies to fight poverty, often with what turned out to be failed policies, but the optimism was thriving. The policies were very uneven in their success, except in one region, East Asia, and that region saw dramatic poverty reduction, even progress against inequality in some countries. Very interesting that essentially the same policy mixture. I don't think there's a dramatic difference in the reformist agendas of the movements at the time in East Asia versus Latin America and Asia. I think the big difference was the attention they gave to inequality. So redistributive land reforms initially, public support for human capital formation. There was a much deeper promotional anti-poverty agenda in most of East Asia in this period. And there I certainly include China. Rebalancing was occurring. The rural development became much more important. Robert McNamara's Nairobi speech was important. The urban bias realizations, the realizations that many of the things we're doing in development policy were skewed heavily against the rural sectors where the poor were concentrated. This was applied to both economy-wide policies and sectoral policies. That rebalancing was necessary, and that came. People like Michael Lipton, hugely influential there. Also, another rebalancing was in human development. Early emphasis very much on incomes as the sole metric of welfare were never really sustainable. We always realized that wasn't the case, but better and better arguments were made, including Amartya Sen's arguments about human capabilities. We started to develop human capabilities instead of primary goods and rules. This was one of Sen's critiques of rules, but was extremely important. A new international commitment emerged in the international financial institutions, somewhat roughly and badly in the early stages. It's still a shock to me how the policies of the World Bank in the 1980s were I think, had some deeply thought aspects in how they addressed concerns about poverty and distribution. And that was rightly pointed out by critics at the time. That correction occurred, I think, in the bank in the 1990s, but it was more a return in the World Bank thinking back to the 1980s rather than the beginning of something new. It was more a rebalancing of the against the arguments of the 1980s, which had largely neglected poverty. Final blow to the idea of the utility of poverty. I think that blow has come convincingly, and again, economics has been key here. A realization that moving from the utility of poverty really to the inefficiency of poverty, and much stronger foundations for that. Realizing that poverty is not in the main the result of bad choices by poor people, it's a result of things like market and government failures. And that realization is now fundamental, but that realization is new. A history that goes back a long way in the literature, back to Keynes and others on the role of the debate about whether inequality is good or bad for growth. I don't think that debate is over, but I think substantial consensus would now take the view that inequality is typically bad for economic development. Certain sorts of inequalities are particularly bad. Some may be even positive, but inequalities of opportunity, inequalities in people's access to finance, schooling, healthcare, are critical. They're not only bad from the point of view of inequality, they're bad from the point of view of aggregate economic growth. Poverty is now seen as instrumentally bad, and mounting evidence as well on that point. But it's not all poverty, it's not all inequalities. We're also starting to unpack that, to understand better what aspect of poverty, what aspect of inequality is most harmful to overall economic development, as well as being intrinsically undesirable. This is nothing, I'm not saying we should only judge this by growth, it's just one side of the story. So we've started to realize that poorer countries and more unequal countries will tend to have two problems for poverty reduction. They'll have too little growth, and the growth that does occur will have too little impact on poverty. Finally, the political economy of all of this. I think we've moved through a developed and out of struggle, a lot of political struggles. And I've not mentioned some important characters like an important role played by the labour movement in a number of countries, but a struggle over a long, protracted period, which was really a struggle for promotional anti-poverty policy and making that a fundamental thing in development policy more broadly, including the development policy in rich countries. Why did that happen? How did we move from this equilibrium of protection only to this equilibrium of protection plus promotion? Political economy, I think, is a big part of it. I mean, if you go back to the 18th century, the idea of lifting people out of poverty, this would be heavy, heavy lifting. There was just so much of it. The cost of that would have been very high. You would have, if you had a lot of people stuck in a poverty trap, you were talking about huge investments to get them out of that poverty trap. It would have been a big deal. You could have done it, and eventually you would have seen rapid poverty reduction, probably quite quickly. But you can probably understand that there was a certain amount of resistance to that on the political economy side. Moving to an equilibrium with more protection, much more rapid poverty reduction, starts to become a cycle, a virtuous cycle of poverty reduction. The promotional policies start to have much more bite in poverty reduction, and they start to become much more feasible at lower levels of poverty. So we start to see this acceleration out of poverty. The catch-22 in all of this is moving between those two equilibria, and that's never going to be easy. The protection-only equilibrium, and now I'm really speaking to policy in developing countries today, the protection-only equilibrium to the promotional equilibrium is a huge step, and countries like India have still not made that step. Can we maintain the new pace of progress against extreme poverty? I think we can. A continuation of the policies since 1950, and particularly since 2000. It's not something I've shown you, but there's also been another kind of less dramatic structural break after 2000, particularly associated with increasing growth rates and more rapid poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa, which is really good news. If we can maintain that rate of progress, we are going to see the elimination, virtual elimination, of extreme absolute poverty within a generation. Okay, I think more than any time before this is possible. That's my reading of the history. Happy for any comments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the role of capital accumulation in reducing poverty. You mentioned labour augmenting technical progress,
yeah.
But I mean, I think historically it's the realisation that it's labour saving initially until capital accumulates and you can then generate more employment opportunities. And I mean, it does seem to me that the reduction of poverty that you showed in your graph had very much to do with the rapid accumulation of capital in China and one or two other developing countries. And in a sense, that has raised the issue of comparative poverty in the United States and other countries that have been involved in that trade.
Fair enough. Do we want to collect or go one at a time? Or?
I think you go one at a time.
One at a time then. I think I'm not sure that there is an agreement on the point about it being initially labour saving, but I think labour augmenting seems to be my reading of it. But I think I don't think a lot. If you initially, I could live with that initially. I think capital accumulation in Europe, I think was hugely important to the growth process. It only became important to the poverty reduction once we started to see rising real wage rates coming out of that, and I've already discussed that. And this is not just a story about China. 2 points about that. I mean, China played a huge role from 1980, but this change was happening from 1950. Poverty reduction in China didn't start in any significant way, in my view, till about 1980. Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1978, and then we saw over the subsequent 20 years, we saw a dramatic, huge reduction in poverty. But what's actually happened under the surface? Essentially, not just China. China was not playing a role initially. China coming into the story, importantly, in the 1980s and 90s. Actually, now we're talking, since 2000, we're actually not just talking about China. China's not playing such a huge role. It's much more India and sub-Saharan Africa. India very recently, sub-Saharan Africa, all since 2000. So that's my broad brush picture. I'm not denying the importance of China in this story. The poverty reduction in the period from 1980 to 2000, a large share of that was driven by China. For example, in that period, if you take China out of the calculation, the number of poor in the rest of the world would remain fairly constant. Poverty percentage was falling, but number remaining fairly constant. So China, big part of the story. And no surprise there, because in China, by this absolute standard, there were 600 million people, fewer poor in 2000 relative to 1980. I think what makes me more optimistic now is it's spread well beyond China. And the fact that sub-Saharan Africa is now an important part of the story is clearly relevant. The absolute versus relative, I have focused solely on absolute poverty. The paper that is developing out of this, it's pretty much finished, has a section on relative poverty and the historical perspective, and there's all kinds of arguments we can make about that, and I think it's important, but it's that's a very long, I'll give a very long answer to that. I am very much of the view that it is only absolute poverty in the welfare space. That's the only thing that makes any sense to me. And here I agree fully with Amartya Sen. It's just when we think about welfare, whether we're talking about capabilities or utility is another issue. But if we agree on a metric of welfare, we have to be, I think, poverty is absolute in that metric. That means it may be relative in the income space. And I'm quite comfortable with that. What I'm not comfortable with, to cut a long story short, is the idea that poverty lines set at a constant proportion of the mean. What is done in Western Europe, for example, and the OECD. This, to my mind, makes very little sense, and I've written a lot on why it doesn't make much sense. But I think we should have another question. If you want to ask me why relative poverty lines, strongly relative poverty lines don't make sense, I'll happily come back to that, but let's open it up.
Yes. Isn't this distinction between protection and promotion rather tenuous? Only if you have protection, then you can have promotion, as is shown in India. The protection of poverty and promotion you're talking about. Yeah. Without protection, you can't have promotion, I think, because that's what's happening in India. When you protect the poor people with some cash subsidies, with minimum wages and so on, then they can send their children to school, and that promotes, right? So this distinction between promotion and protection and sense human capabilities seem to be rather tenuous.
Well, it doesn't make it tenuous. If you argued that protection was necessary for promotion, that's not saying the distinction's tenuous. It's just saying that ensuring people may be necessary for promoting them. I don't see why that's the case, but I'm just saying logically, it doesn't mean that the distinction is tenuous. I don't think there's anything. In fact, the distinction, I think, is quite well defined. India, I would argue, has, if you think of the two most populous countries, India and China, I'd say India has not got the message yet on promotion, and I do not believe that protection, the protection is very effective. China, on the other hand, I think has invested too little in protection. It's been doing promotion ahead of protection, which also emphasises that you can do them in the other order. Very little emphasis in anti-poverty policy in China on protection. Poor people are badly insured in China. There's very little. Anti-poverty policy in China has been heavy emphasis on poor area development and on promotional policies in schooling and healthcare more recently, but that was falling apart for quite a while. The big emphasis in the 80s in China was on poor area development. Very little discussion of, for example, the sorts of policies on workfare policies you had, like the employment guarantee schemes in India. Not much sign of that in China. Now, whether these things work, these protection policies work in India is another matter, and here I'd argue their performance is at best mixed. I've just finished a book on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, NREGA, and that, in a nutshell, was the conclusion of the book.
There was a question over here.
Yes.
Okay. Could you introduce some main approaches of anti-poverty in World Bank? And could you give us some examples? Thank you.
Of anti-poverty policy in the World Bank? Well, you know, the World Bank, I think, is basically just reflected thinking more broadly. Right? I don't think there's been certainly some innovation coming out of the bank in anti-poverty policy, but also a reflection, and that's not surprising because the World Bank works for its member countries and tries to serve their needs. But the anti-poverty policies that I've talked about here are very much the sorts of policies that are talked about in poverty reduction strategies for the World Bank, and the three key elements of that are growth-promoting economic policies, delivering better health and education to poor people, and social protection. So, promotion, first two, growth-oriented economic policies, promotion through delivering better services, the better protection, and protection. So again, it spans those differences as well. The balance between growth-promoting economic policies to promote economic growth alone, growth-promoting policies or economy-wide policies that emphasize growth through financial sector reform, through reforms in access to finance and in trade, those reforms are the emphasis you give to those reforms relative to services and social protection has evolved. It's essentially gone in waves, if you like, in the bank. We had periods when, in the 1980s, where it was really just about growth-promoting reforms, and then we had periods when it was much more shift. I'd say since around 1990 till now, there's been a big shift toward particularly health, education, and social protection as elements of anti-poverty policy. But all of that said in a way that is realizing that the benefits of those policies are not universally reaching poor people. It's also about making sure that they do. That's why I said delivering social services to poor people. And that discussion has also been about access, incentives, the use of things like conditional cash transfers to incentivize investments in human development, and also delivery and service provision, but also understanding the incentives of service providers. So we progressively moved toward a discussion which was essentially about building schools to a discussion which was about building schools, yes, but making sure that teachers are incentivized to turn up. India is famous for this. I've been to so many villages in India where I go to the school. I've got this what's that?
Not all parts of India.
Well, tell me where I'm wrong. I mean, if you're talking about Kerala, sure, but you know, most of India. I've travelled every state of India. One exception. I see schools, but I very often see nicely built schools that are empty, and I will look around. One of my favourite things is to find the real school, which will typically be in some crowded room with some private teacher, and they're paying 100 rupees a month, and because of the dysfunctionality of the delivery system. But again, I take the point that some bits of India have done much better than this, and Kerala is an outstanding example. And every country has this issue. You'll have places like India, Kerala on the one hand versus, say, Punjab, Haryana on the other. Kerala did a great job on social policies way back to the 40s even. I mean, there was really a long history of really good social policies in health and education. What they did is finance or support the most rapid poverty reduction of any state of India. People don't realize this. Kerala, with a largely communist government over this period, had amazing progress against poverty. But it failed hopelessly on the other side of the equation. Remember I said growth-promoting policies, delivering social services, its growth-promoting, its investment climate was terrible. Where you have places at the far other end of India, where in Punjab, Haryana, where the investment climate has been much more favourable, but the social policies much worse. No state of India has ever combined, I've never seen any state of India combining the two in the effective way that, say, Indonesia has done. and hence we haven't seen the kind of rapid poverty reduction. Signs of it very recently in India. So you get, I think that's the best answer I can give you. Three pillars, if you like. That's World Bank orthodoxy. I don't think I'm saying anything terribly controversial.
When cheap labour forms such a large part of the attractiveness of, or the attraction of developing countries to gain FDI, do you think some of the policies they implement to help improve poverty, has given their full backing to the policies, or are they helping the people to get out of poverty to a certain level, but keep them at a level where their cheapness, I guess, or their low salary is a benefit to the country themselves when they're trying to attract foreign investments?
Well, it'll go through a natural progression, as it is in China now. I mean, you'll get, after a time, where real wages will start to rise, and that's a good thing. You're happy to have foreign investment attracted to the low wages. That the correcting mechanism that is occurring is eventually the wages will start to rise as that investment, the capital accumulation occurs, and the sort of story we've been telling. How long that happens, I think some people argue China was the Lewis model. The way I described England is one possible interpretation, one that I'm not entirely comfortable with, nor am I comfortable with in China, but in the literature you'll get an argument which basically says that there was a labour surplus in rural areas in England in the 18th century and in China till recently. You had to absorb that labour surplus before you'd see a rising real wages. Once you reach beyond that point, real wages will start to rise, and there'll be a natural correcting process to that. But that's a good thing for poverty reduction. It's not a bad thing, and I think we should be happy that real wages are rising in China. That means that the type of, it won't attract the same sort of investment. China will start to be a foreign investor of its own, which it is, investing in Africa big time. Not necessarily in things that are going to be great for poverty reduction, but some things, yes. Depends. So I don't think it's something, it's not a process that worries me terribly much. If you try to force this process either way, restraining the wage increases or encouraging the wage changes, then I think you can get problems. It depends how you do it and so on. I mean, I'm not against the statutory minimum wage rates, they just have to be sensible, and I think it's yeah.
Given that every country within its own borders would say that they've got people within that country, their own citizens, in poverty of some sort. So each country has its own definition of poverty within its own borders. Then how can any country, or even the world in general, ever get out of poverty? If poverty in one country is that family hasn't got a television, and poverty in another country is they haven't got clean water or social security, then it's never going to equalise on a global scale. So how can you ever say that poverty is ever going to be eradicated?
Okay, good question. Let's think about it this way. And thinking about global poverty, there are two things we've got to consider. One is, forget countries. Think about everybody as a global citizen. For that global world, I would argue we need one poverty line, multiple poverty lines, but it has to be common across countries. Then I think we also have to think about the other model, if you like, where we think of your poverty as depending on where you live. So in the first model, ignore where you live, it doesn't play any role, we're all global citizens, part of one world. In the second model, we think about poverty as depending crucially on your relative position within some society. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. In fact, I argue that we should have both those goals in mind when we talk about eradicating poverty. And you're perfectly correct that when we talk about the second way of thinking about it, it will take much longer. In fact, it'll take a lot longer, right? And I've written about this, to eradicate poverty when using the definitions of poverty in each country. But I don't think that's, I think that's to be noted. But at the same time, think about it this way. If you put all the world's citizens together and said, look, I want to get everybody above whatever it is, $1 a day, $2 a day, as global, as a community of people, I think we should be striving for that. It's a moral imperative that says, to my mind, we should always focus on the poorest first. And I think that moral imperative applies in a country, but it doesn't apply any less as global citizens either. So I would say there's a natural prioritization. We should first focus on the world's poorest and move up progressively. I would love to get everybody above Luxembourg's poverty line. I was using $1 a day here. That's the average, roughly the average poverty line of the poorest 20 or so countries in the world. So it's a really low poverty line, no question. What's the highest poverty line? It's Luxembourg, $43 a day. Great, but first things first, I would argue it's morally compelling that we should focus on the poorest first in thinking about poverty and move our way up. Happily get everybody above $43 a day eventually.
I guess just to follow up on that last comment, but isn't that the exact sort of situation that makes attaining sort of these measures of poverty difficult, in the sense of when we start to look at, say, our own country views?
Yeah.
I don't think, I'm not sure what equilibrium position that would be when everyone has the same poverty level, say, of Luxembourg, but I can imagine why it will take so long to achieve, because I'm not convinced that's a possible position that is equilibrium for the world's global population, so to speak, in terms of where, I don't know, resources or everything else will settle. I'm not an economist, so I'm just kind of winging this. There's an article, I was trying to reference the article, it's called The History of Poverty, Making Poverty History. I don't know the source, but maybe you're familiar with it. I read it maybe 2 years ago or something like that. Yeah. But it was a bit of a pessimistic view in terms of, how countries become poor, the known countries which are poor, and the history that led to that. And yeah, it was more pessimistic. It wasn't painting a positive picture in terms of thinking that, countries will get out of poverty all over the world, so to speak.
I think all I'm saying is we can be now optimistic about virtually eliminating extreme absolute poverty. That's what I said, right? That's just saying that we've now got about 1.2 billion people living below $1.25 a day in the world. I think we can get that number down by a full 1 billion within 15 to 20 years, continuing the way we're going. Right? We don't have any major reversals, no major crises or the lasting permanent crises. Things look pretty good. So that's the optimistic. If you ask me, as I said before, if you ask me getting everybody above a higher poverty line, $2 a day, $3 a day, or getting everybody above the idea of poverty in their own country, that's going to take much, much longer. So I don't think we have a disagreement there. I do have an idea of the feasibility of how we get to 1 billion people above $1.25 a day. And I'd argue that would be huge social progress. This is like breathtaking. We've had this burden of poverty, of extreme poverty in the world, and this would be a major human achievement. I don't think that's in doubt. It's in reach, and we know how to do it. We really do. The rest, I'd argue, whether we get there or how we get there, I don't know. But I think first things first. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have to call it a day. Thank you very much to you for coming, and thank you to Martin.